Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be lecturing on Chapter 5, Section 2, A New Direction for the American Government. So the first two presidents of the United States, George Washington and John Adams, were Federalists. Now, George Washington never said he was part of the Federalist Party. He actually spoke out against political parties, but he aligned himself more with the Federalist style of governance. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were the head of the Federalist Party. Remember, Hamilton gets killed in a duel. He was killed by Aaron Burr in 1804. So the election of 1800 was a rematch between unpopular John Adams and fairly popular Thomas Jefferson. And the election of 1800, we talked about this already, was really important because it was the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. And so the Democratic Republicans take power from the Federalists. Obviously, the Federalists were not happy about this, but they peacefully gave up power. On top of capturing the presidency in 1800, the Democratic Republicans also won control of Congress, so they were able to pass a lot of their legislation. Thomas Jefferson liked to call this the election of 1800 a revolution in the principles of our government. And the Federalists would never hold national power again. They will never reclaim the presidency. And the Jefferson administration leaves a profound legacy. And the main thing that it is known for is doubling the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. So when Jefferson takes over, he encourages Congress to abandon the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts were the acts that said that it took from 5 to 14 years for non-citizens to become citizens. And the reason he wanted to do that was because most immigrants voted for the Democratic Republicans. This was partisan legislation. The Sedition Acts said that it was illegal to speak out against the government. Obviously, a First Amendment, no, you can't do that. That violates your freedom of speech. Jefferson also gets rid of taxes on stamps, certain pieces of land, and alcoholic spirits. If you remember the Whiskey Rebellion, remember when Washington rode in with militiamen to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, which was over a tax on whiskey. He reduces taxes, but even though he reduces taxes, he's able to cut the national debt from 80 to 57 million by making cuts to our Army and Navy and paid government positions. Now, this is actually going to be harmful to the government because when we fight the War of 1812, we're basically not going to have much of a Navy because for 8 years, Jefferson essentially ignored our military. And then when we have to fight the British in 1812, we're not going to be as well prepared. During Jefferson's administration, imports rose from foreign trade, and the sales of federal land to settlers moving west helped the government pay down some of our debts. So we were paying off some of our debts through selling land to people that were trying to expand westward. If you can look at that chart, it shows around the year 1801, our debt starts to dramatically decrease, and that was because of the policies of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is on the $2 bill, in case you did not know that. I know they're rather rare anymore, but he is on the $2 bill. The presidency of Jefferson was a huge change in style. See, the Federalists thought that displays of wealth and power made the public respect their leaders more. Whereas Jefferson, even though he was super wealthy, very well educated, in fact, his library becomes the core of our national library, the Library of Congress. So even though Jefferson was wealthy, educated, refined, he tried to come across more as a common man like presidents do today. They go out, they talk to people, they visit, mom and pop shops. They try to say, hey, I'm one of you. And Jefferson was an early example of this. Jefferson hated displays of wealth. He saw them as a threat to the American public. So he tries to come across as hey, I'm just one of you guys. He hated the ceremony of the presidency, and he tried to unite all Americans. And one of my favorite quotes that we'll talk about all year, and I still think it applies even today, is he says, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And what he meant by that was, it doesn't matter what your political party is, right? It doesn't matter in 2025 or whatever year, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, you're a Democrat. We're all looking for America to be successful. You might have different visions of how that should go, but at the end of the day, we're all in it for what's best for America. And I really like that quote because he's basically saying, you might be a Republican, I might be a Federalist, but or vice versa in his case, but we all want what's best. And I'm here to govern not just one party, not just my side, but both sides. when Jefferson became president in 1801, John Marshall became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, meaning like he's the head of the Supreme Court. They were actually cousins, but they were political rivals. John Marshall was a staunch Federalist. He believed in the power of the national government, whereas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. He wanted more power in the hands of the states. But Marshall was appointed last minute by John Adams. That was one of the last things that John Adams did. John Adams actually appointed a ton of judges. They called it the midnight judges because he appointed them right before he left office in a way to like try to stick it to Thomas Jefferson. But Marshall leaves his stamp on the Supreme Court. I would argue he's probably the most influential Supreme Court justice that we've ever had because he was part of over 1,000 court decisions. He wrote half of him himself. More than any other Supreme Court justice in U.S. history. And he served for 35 years because when you are elected to the Supreme Court, when you are nominated and appointed to the Supreme Court, you serve for life or until you resign. Now, the legacy of the Marshall Court is in Marbury versus Madison. So the case of Marbury versus Madison establishes the power of judicial review. And what judicial review is, it allows the Supreme Court to look at acts of Congress or acts of the president, and they get to judge, yes, this is constitutional, or no, this is unconstitutional, and they can strike down a law. And because of this, the Supreme Court gets to say something is constitutional or not. And the Marshall Court goes on throughout his 35 years to clearly establish the supremacy of the federal government over the states. And Marshall, a Federalist much like Alexander Hamilton, interpreted the Constitution broadly. Basically, he was saying, like, as long as the Constitution doesn't outright say we can't do it, we should be able to do it. Whereas the Democratic Republicans, they were on the other side of things. They said, if it's not in the Constitution, we can't do it. Whereas the Federalists were like, it doesn't say we can't, and an example of that is the national bank. People like Hamilton argued, like, hey, we can have a national bank. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says we can't, whereas the Federalists were saying we can't have a national bank because it's not in the Constitution, or the Democratic Republicans, sorry. All right, so how does judicial review work? So let's just say something goes to the Supreme Court today. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, so that there's never a tie. What happens is a ruling comes to the Supreme Court from a lower court. The Supreme Court then gets to decide, yes, we're going to take the case. No, we're not. From there, 4 out of the 9 justices have to agree to take the case. Once they take the case, they hear arguments from both sides. They then debate amongst each other the merits of both sides, and then they give their opinion. And every Supreme Court case has a majority opinion and a minority opinion, meaning the winning side writes an opinion and the losing side, the dissenting side, writes an opinion. This happens for every Supreme Court case. It still happens today. It will always happen as long as we have the government that we currently have. And this is kind of how things worked all the way back to the Marshall Court with the process of judicial review. All right, make sure you write the notes down, copy them down, and submit them for points. Thank you.